Hi everyone. Today we're dissecting the moment when British arrogance clashed with Russian resolve and lost by a score that leaves no room for ambiguity. The British decided to provoke Russia near Crimea, habitually counting on endless warnings without consequences. But this time, there were none. There was a cold and calculated order from Belousov to shoot to kill when crossing the border. By the end of the video, you'll understand why London tested Russian patience for so long, what made Moscow change tactics from warning to destruction, and how one order from the Minister of Defense turned all of NATO's ideas about the safety of provocations near Russian shores upside down. Stay until the end. There will be the most important thing about the moment when words end and actions begin. Let's start with the history of British provocations, because without understanding the context, it is impossible to assess the revolutionary nature of what happened. For years, Britain tested Russian patience in the Crimea region, regularly sending warships into the waters adjacent to the peninsula, demonstratively violating or approaching the borders of territorial waters. The scenario was repeated with predictability. British SMI enter the disputed zone. Russia records the violation. A warning follows over the radio. The British ignore it, but Russian ships approach to demonstrate force. Aviation flies around the British vessel at low altitude. Then a diplomatic note of protest follows. The Russian Foreign Ministry summons the British ambassador, sets out a tough position on the inadmissibility of provocations, demands an end to the violation of sovereignty, and warns of possible consequences. The British recorded all the warnings, nodded, and repeated the provocation a few months later, because they understood that Russia would not shoot, limiting itself to a demonstration of force and diplomatic protests. It is possible to provoke with impunity, collect intelligence about the Russian reaction, and test air defense systems. London ridiculed Russian warnings. British politicians publicly stated that Russia was bluffing, that endless threats without the real use of force showed weakness, that Russian red lines could be ignored without consequences. The British press mocked Russian statements about protecting sovereignty. They wrote that Moscow only knew how to threaten, but not to act, that the Russian fleet was only capable of demonstrative rapprochement, but not of real opposition. This self-confidence was based on years of impunity. Britain provoked, Russia warned. Britain repeated, Russia warned again. The cycle was complete. London was sure that it would always be like this. They decided to ridicule Russia's constant warnings again. This was precisely the logic behind the next provocation. A British warship headed for the territorial waters of Crimea. Not for the first time, not for the last time according to the command's plans. A routine operation to demonstrate presence and gather intelligence. The crew prepared for the standard scenario. We will enter the disputed zone. The Russians will start yelling over the radio. Airplanes will arrive and circle around. Ships will come up to threaten. We will stand for several hours, collect data, and leave. Then Moscow will summon the ambassador, as usual. But this time, everything went according to a different scenario. The British ship approached the border of the territorial waters of Crimea, crossed the 12-mile zone, and then something began that no one on board expected. There were none. There were no warnings, no familiar shouts on the radio, no approach of Russian ships for demonstration, no flights of aviation, silence. An ominous, unusual silence. The British commander felt something was wrong. The absence of reaction meant either the Russians didn't notice, it is impossible, their radars see everything, or they are preparing something else, something that the British are not ready for. There was a cold and calculated order from Belousov. The Russian Minister of Defense decided to change tactics. Enough warnings. Years of empty threats have only strengthened the enemy's arrogance. It's time to show that Russian borders are defended not by words, but by deeds. The order was clear and ruthless. Any foreign warship crossing the border of territorial waters without permission is destroyed immediately. Without prior warning, without attempting to make contact, without a chance to correct the mistake. Shoot to kill when crossing the border. The wording left no room for interpretation. Not warning shots, not shooting to the side for intimidation, but shooting to kill. The goal is to sink the intruder. Belousov gave this order after much deliberation, understood the consequences, knew that the sinking of a British ship would cause an international crisis, but also understood that endless warnings of inaction had turned Russia into a laughingstock. The Minister of Defense calculated the risks. Britain will be outraged, but will not dare to start a war directly. NATO will express concern, but Article 5 will not work because the British ship itself violated foreign waters. The West will threaten sanctions, which are already at their maximum. But Russian borders will finally become truly protected. Foreign ships will stop unpunished provocations. Red lines will take on real meaning. Respect for Russian sovereignty will be restored through a demonstration of force. The order was communicated to all units guarding the Crimean waters, coastal artillery, missile systems, aviation, and the fleet. Everyone received one instruction. The border violator is destroyed without warning. The British ship entered territorial waters, crossed the line that it had crossed dozens of times before without consequences. The commander did not yet understand that the rules had changed, that this time there would be no shouting on the radio and demonstrative flights. The coastal missile system launched an anti-ship missile, one with precise guidance. British air defense systems detected the launch late. They did not expect a real attack, tried to intercept it, but the missile was going too fast, too low, hit the above-water part of the hull. The explosion pierced the side. Water poured inside. The systems are damaged. The ship began to list. The crew panicked and rushed to the rescue equipment. The commander sent a distress signal. The British ship was sinking not metaphorically, but literally. He went underwater off the Crimean coast. The crew evacuated on a boat. Russian ships approached not to attack, but to rescue. Russia is not interested in casualties among sailors, only in eliminating the provocation. London is in shock. They did not expect Russia to actually shoot. For years, they were accustomed to impunity. Suddenly, it turned out that Moscow's patience has limits, that warnings sooner or later end in action. The British government convened an emergency meeting. The Prime Minister demands explanations from the Admiralty on how the ship was allowed to sink. The admirals shrugged their shoulders. The Russians changed tactics, shooting without warning. The ship was in disputed waters. Disputed is a key word. Britain does not recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea, considers these waters international or Ukrainian, but Russia controls Crimea de facto and defends it as its territory. The dispute over jurisdiction does not negate the reality of Russian power. London is trying to blow up a scandal, accuses Russia of aggression against a British ship in international waters, demands condemnation from the international community, calls on NATO for solidarity. But the alliance's reaction is cool, because everyone understands that the British provoked it themselves. For years, they climbed into the waters that Russia considers its own. They ignored warnings, ridiculed Russian red lines, and got what they had been warned about for years. NATO does not want to go to war with Russia because of British stupidity. The alliance expresses concern, promises to consider the incident, calls for de-escalation. But no one proposes concrete actions. Article 5 is not activated because the British ship itself violated foreign borders. The United States distances itself from the incident. Washington is not happy with British provocations, which threaten to drag America into the conflict. The State Department calls on both sides for restraint. Between the lines it reads, Britain, stop teasing the Russians. France and Germany openly criticize London for irresponsibility. Paris and Berlin do not want escalation with Russia. They consider British provocations a dangerous game. Now that the game has resulted in the sinking of a ship, the Europeans do not intend to solve British problems. Britain found itself in isolation, counting on the support of allies, and received a cold shoulder. Everyone understands that London is to blame. It has been provoking for years. Received an answer. Now let him figure it out himself. Belousov publicly commented on the incident. The Minister of Defense said, Russia has been warning for years about the inadmissibility of provocations. Britain ignored all warnings. Now Moscow has moved from words to deeds. Any border violator will be destroyed without additional warnings. This statement is revolutionary. Russia has officially abandoned the practice of endless warnings. Established a new rule. A border is a border. If you cross without permission, you will be destroyed. It doesn't matter whose flag is on the ship. It doesn't matter how many times it has crossed with impunity before. NATO is forced to revise its operational plans near Russian borders. Now every reconnaissance flight, every approach of a ship is a risk of being destroyed. Russia has proven its willingness to use force. Provocations have become deadly. Previously, it was possible to test the Russian reaction relatively safely. Now each provocation can end in the loss of a ship, plane, or the lives of the crew. The price of the game has risen to an unacceptable level. The British fleet received instructions to avoid Russian territorial waters. The Admiralty does not want to lose any more ships. One sunken destroyer is enough of a lesson. London will look for other ways to provoke Russia, safer ones. Other NATO countries are also drawing conclusions. If Russia sank a British ship, it could sink a French, American, or any other ship. No one wants to test Russian resolve at the cost of their own ships. Belousov's cold and calculated order worked. With one blow, the Minister of Defense achieved what years of warnings had not achieved. He restored respect for Russian borders, showed that red lines are not a bluff. The British no longer ridicule Russian warnings. Now they know the warnings are over. Russia has moved on to action. Every border violation entails the real use of force. This is a new reality for NATO, a reality where provocations near Russian borders are deadly, where you can't count on Moscow's endless patience, where one wrong step can cost a ship and lives. Belousov's order changed the balance of power. Not by increasing Russian power, It has always been sufficient, but by changing the willingness to use this power. Russia has shown the ability to shoot not only in response to an attack, but preventively against border violators. Shoot to kill, a wording that NATO must remember. Russia is no longer messing with provocateurs. Borders are protected by real force. Violators are destroyed without trial or investigation. Write in the comments what you think about the sinking of the British ship without warnings. Did Russia change tactics correctly? Or should we have continued with endless warnings? Is Britain to blame for what happened, or is it Russian aggression? And most importantly, will NATO stop provocations after this lesson, or will the escalation continue? We need a discussion. We need your opinions, because we are observing a fundamental change in the rules of the game. When years of warnings are replaced by instantaneous actions, when patience turns into determination, when an order to shoot to kill replaces diplomatic notes. Follow the developments and remember that in international relations, endless patience is perceived as weakness. And the moment when weakness turns into strength through a demonstration of willingness to use weapons becomes a turning point for all provocateurs accustomed to impunity. M.